Hi, I'm Rachel.
I'm Viktor.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
And I'm Christian. And we're designers that have been working on this material design project, helping our various products at Google to bring the material design to it. So yesterday in the keynote, we introduced this concept of material design. And it's a system that uses the classical tools of print-like graphic design, along with some new dynamic surfaces that appeal to our innate understanding of physics and material. So today we're going to talk about how some of the visual design concepts that help to define that system. So it's not often recognized about design that a good portion of it happens behind the scenes. People don't actually recognize or notice actively a lot of the things choices that we make as designers. Sometimes even people thinking about visual design think of it as a skinning or a covering that's kind of happened at the very last moment. And today we want to show that beauty isn't skin deep. We want to challenge that idea of visual design as a skin. We want to talk about the visible and invisible structures that make the material UI work. So we'll show how invisible grids can hold the structure together. We'll talk about the rules behind the scenes that can help us have better imagery. And we'll pull the camera back to show the lighting and the shadow systems. So I'll start with one of the more invisible, yet visible everywhere design practices, typography. Typography is a lot more than just the choice of typeface, but the letter forms are a good place to start. So I'll start talking about Roboto. Roboto is a custom typeface that's designed with UI specifically in mind. It's a digital native. And we're using a new cut of Roboto as the default typeface for the material UI. We've extensively reworked the outlines to make sure that the types work not just on mobile and tablet, where we've started using it, but across the various form factors that we're now covering. So here's some of the changes. This way you'll be able to pick out the new version versus the old version and impress your type-obsessed friends. So we've calmed down some of the more unruly characters. We also rounded out the square sides on the caps, as well as the dots and the punctuation. We also completely redrew the numbers. And getting into the details, we reworked all of the italics so that we have better optical correction to the diagonal stroke. So if you look at the right leg of the A versus the left leg of the A, you might notice a very slight difference. So really, we tweaked almost every single glyph to polish and tune. There's a lot of changes in the spacing and the metrics. I'll spare you the rest of the details. But the typeface itself really is only a part of typography. In fact, if you call a type designer a typographer, they'll point out the difference between the two. Typography is the use of type. One of our design principles was to enable content that's bold and graphic and intentional. And this graphic character starts with the typography. In fact, when you actually look at UIs, it's clear that on almost every screen, type is the primary element. So if I block out just the type on the right, you can see how the screen really is structured by the typography. In fact, this is a good exercise as you're designing things to just block it out and just look at the type itself and see if it contains the structure. UI design really is typography. If we're drawing screens, whether we know it or not, we're typographers. So this design system uses really big type to be expressive, but also to create clear hierarchies of information. It's tempting when we're doing UI design just because we're always dealing with dynamic content, it's tempting to just use the smallest size possible because we don't know in a music player if the band name is going to be super long, or we don't know if in a calculator that we're going to have a calculation that's super long. Instead, we can use large type and then adjust the size to accommodate the copy as needed. So it's these large display sizes that are also another opportunity for branding where you might consider using a custom type, commissioning a new type, or even licensing a type. It's easier than it might seem. So to help us manage the sizes, we use a tool called a typographic scale. This isn't a new idea. This has been around in print for a long time. In fact, the classic typographic scale uses the same math as the musical pentatonic scale. It makes sure that there's enough contrast at each step. And what it really does is reduces the amount of distinct sizes on any one screen so that information is clear and you can tell those differences. A good rule of thumb is if you're using more than 2 or 3 sizes on one screen, you should make sure that there's a good reason for it. And if you are using a size that's not in the typographic scale, there should be a really good reason for it. Ultimately, though, the purpose of type is to serve the content. It's to help people quickly parse and communicate the information. And while typography uses up a good portion of our screen real estate in many UIs, it's hard to beat imagery, both photographs and illustrations, for impact.
So this epitomizing phrase that we've been hearing a lot of content being bold, graphic, and intentional is especially apparent with the use of imagery in product. So we aren't here to encourage specific aesthetic identities. Product brands range from being subdued and muted to really bright and colorful, and our intention isn't to prescribe brand. What we want to encourage is intentionality and thoughtfulness concerning imagery, backed by supported principles and best practices to make your imagery and your products come to life and feel really differentiated. So we define the main principles of imagery in a kind of a 3-part statement. Be personal, be informative, and be delightful. So personalize the imagery where applicable to make your product feel relevant. A degree of intelligence is automatically communicated if imagery accurately reflects the user. Inform the user with a visual translation of information. This facilitates comprehension and allows for expedited understanding of information. And delight. Delight doesn't mean adding superfluous, fluffy imagery just to fill space. Delight really implies aesthetic thoughtfulness combined with appropriate contextual use. Delight can make your product feel not only special, but really considerate of the user. So some additional principles to talk through. Imagery doesn't have to be consistently conspicuous to feel appropriate. So this concept of being immersive, right? The image above is a great example of using imagery to create context and interest without overpowering the primary information. The artist's portrait is a textural background for the interactive music content, which is the primary focus. Use appropriate imagery hinting at contextualization to kind of create this type of depth and texture in your product. So be thoughtfully ubiquitous. So ubiquitous imagery, similar to delight, doesn't imply superfluous use without a rationale. Ubiquity here implies searching for very intentional visual opportunities where previously there might have been disparities. So look for these moments to introduce imagery that supports information, personalization, and delight. So context. Users should feel that in every instance imagery is visible, it feels relevant and appropriate, and not disorienting or misleading or out of place. So this doesn't always mean that imagery has to be a literal translation of surrounding information, right? So the example above is perfect. We don't see the literal facade of the location of your event, rather a feature image from the location that provides context. But context in the type of context such as cuisine and the general aesthetic and vibe, and potentially even the time of day. So this contextual accuracy, combined with really beautiful imagery, will create the best possible experience for your users. So best practices, I want to touch really lightly on some overarching practices when creating or commissioning imagery. From an aesthetic perspective, the main goal, right, is to create beautiful images, right? Your users will feel inspired and excited to use your product. But beautiful imagery is a somewhat broad and amorphous term. So here are some overarching tips, basically, to point you in the right direction. Ensure that a clear concept is conveyed in a memorable way with having a point of focus. This doesn't necessarily literally translate as a single point of focus in your image. Focus more so conveys that there is clear representation that won't be lost on the user. The user should be able to parse almost immediately what the visual represents. Building narratives takes this concept of focus and adds some flavor, right? Is the mood of the image aspirational, somber, celebratory? So this example of Miami is not only visually informative, in terms of the location that the user is traveling to, but is meant to also be an aspirational and immersive image, right? Creating really positive connotations with your location. So all imagery is an editorialized decision, right? So make intentional decisions about the narrative of your product through imagery. I want to end this section about imagery speaking about some UI integration and kind of how imagery lives within the material design structure. So scale, not all assets hold the same visual weight. An avatar and an account switcher is purposely smaller than a main hero image because of information hierarchy, right? So be mindful of these scale differentiations between imagery types, such as avatars, feature images, et cetera, as well as similar asset types, such as thumbnails within a gallery experience. Scale and hierarchy imply importance, and not all of your assets are equal. Okay, so this seems obvious, but make sure your images are appropriately sized for their containers and across platforms. Material design really emphasizes large containers, large real estate, and ideally these assets should not appear pixelated in your containers cross-platform. So also, as you can see in many of the vignettes, a lot of the UI color choices reflect content, right? So this was spoken about in the keynote. So color and imagery in material design are really symbiotic. These bold color bars, action bars, should look to a really intentional color sampling story. This not only creates a perceived intelligence concerning the content, but will make your product feel unique. We're building a support library called Palette, which was also mentioned in the keynote, which is part of the Android support library and will be part of the L preview release. You will be able to use it pretty much right away. So what the library does was automatically extract a color palette based on a particular image. We're still iterating on the algorithms and the APIs, so expect improvements on this in the future. And Viktor's going to speak more about color in a little bit. So before I end, I want to talk about different image types within the container, so you can start sort of naming these asset types and thinking about how to use these. So avatars and thumbnails. Avatars are representations of entities, brands, and people, and most commonly displayed in circular form. Thumbnails allow the user to peek into additional visual content, usually surrounded by heterogeneous information such as copy, titles, et cetera. They're always actionable into a more immersive view. And I think this is the primary point of what a thumbnail is. They're always hinting at more. So thumbnails are great assets to introduce in really kind of tight and constrained spaces. In material design, we're introducing kind of two types of hero images, featured heroes and integrated heroes. A feature hero is really a bold primary point of focus, surrounded by a heterogeneous layout with additional information, but the user's eye should really look first to this visual while still interacting with the surrounding content. Integrated heroes create a setting for heterogeneous pieces of content within a layout. They're not the primary points of focus, but more so add texture and depth to the scene. Gallery images. Well, gallery images are the most bold visual hero images within your layouts. Usually they're homogeneous layouts, and these are visual heroes without any other visual distractions. These are the strongest and most unobstructed views of imagery within your product. So overall, imagery is a vital part of material design. Thoughtfully incorporating informative, personal, delightful imagery in your product while considering some of these best practices is really going to bring your product to life, creating really memorable and beautifully crafted experiences for your user. So as I mentioned before, imagery is really united with color. So Viktor's going to come up and speak more about that.
Let's talk about color and how to use color to enhance your branding and your user experience. The material design system enables bold and intentional use of color, and I figured the best way to show you this is to design an example app. When choosing your color theme, you should really use your brand colors. If you happen not to have brand colors or so, we've actually created an extensive color palette with beautiful colors that we use ourselves to define our own color themes. This example app's primary color will be indigo blue. This is the main color of the app. So if your brand color is red, for example, this color should really be red. Bold and immersive use of color is strongly encouraged. With that said, not all screens are the same. Density of color depends on the density of content. So in a screen with very little content, it enables bolder use of color than, let's say, a content-heavy list view. Here are a few good examples of how bold color is applied in more generous ways. It brings delight to otherwise utilitarian experiences, such as the calculator, or how it could complement immersive imagery. OK, let's move on and choose the accent color for this app. This color is to provide contrast for important buttons, UI elements, and components. Don't choose an accent color that doesn't provide enough contrast. This color is really supposed to pop. Here are a few good examples of how an accent color can provide the right focus and attention to certain areas or components. If you've chosen an accent color that doesn't work in certain circumstances, don't worry. You can always fall back to a lighter or darker tint of that same color. Pull those colors together, and you'll get your basic color theme. We are very happy that we've baked this into the Android platform and made it a lot easier for you guys to define your own color theme. And remember, the strongest tool we have to unite a color or user experience across multiple platforms and devices is color. So we talked about the design principles. We talked about typography. We talked about imagery and color. Let's bring them all together and design a beautiful and consistent UI. As Zach mentioned earlier in the interaction talk, over the course of the design history, there have emerged rules and guidelines that we as designers are really, really excited about, that we bake this in and include it in the material design system. So here are a few examples of these rules and guidelines. So structural elements in the material design system aligns to an 8-dip grid. This will provide consistency, harmony, and rhythm to your designs. Content should follow a set of key lines: 16-dip and 72-dip on mobile, 24-dip and 80-dip on tablet, desktop, and larger screen sizes. As you can see here, it really orders the content and structures the content so that it becomes more predictable, and your user can read this content a lot easier and faster. Increments is an excellent tool or help to determine the size of larger structural elements, such as the app bar or the nav drawer. The increments are based on the standard app bar height, which is 56-dip on mobile and 64-dip on tablet, desktop, and larger screen sizes. When setting your type, make sure to align it to a 4-dip baseline grid. This will make your typography and content easier to read and make it aesthetically more pleasing. I'm sure everyone here at some point have seen a design or an app and just felt like, oh, there's something off. Not aligning your type to a consistent baseline grid might very well have been what was the problem there. Let's go back to our example app again and apply these rules and guides that we've incorporated in the material design system. This is going to be a fairly straightforward list view app, but I wanted to enable bolder use of color, as I talked about before, so I made the app bar 3x of the increment. When designing your layouts, start thinking in blocks. This is extremely helpful and will make your design process easier, faster, and I would say better. For this app, I'm going to use an avatar to the left with two lines of text next to it. So for that, I'll use a block of 72 dip. When placing in your content, as I said, follow the key lines. In this example, the 16 dip and 24 dip keyline is reserved for icons and avatars. That means that your typography and text should follow the 72 dip and 80 dip keyline. As you can clearly see, it provides a structure and a predictability to the UI that is just very user-friendly and easy to scan. Last but not least, remember the baseline grid. Align your typography to the baseline grid to achieve better typography. And there we have it. By using these, I would say, almost magical tools and guidelines, as well as fundamental tools and guidelines, we've created a bold, beautiful, user-friendly UI over multiple platforms and form factors. Over to Hannah, who's going to talk about surface and dimension.
Thank you. Yay! OK, so Victor just went over on the details of how to create a layout. In material design, you have to also consider how these elements live and move in 3D space, not just 2D. We can model how people perceive material in our UI to group and structure our content. The use of surface and material can solve spatial issues, and they're not meant to be used just as decoration. So in material design, we use this technique to give our UI dimension. So we interact with physical objects every day. The tangible qualities and shadows help us to quickly understand affordances. So we were inspired by the tactile qualities of paper and studied how light interacts with the material to create our shadows. We didn't just apply this approach to our UI, we actually did a lot of studies. We recreated our icons by folding actual pieces of paper and placed them in different lighting setups to understand exactly how the shadows should be constructed. These are actual photos that we studied, the studies that we did, and you can see all the cool things that are happening in these photos. There are soft ambient shadows caused by the light, and you can see how the light is being reflected off the paper, causing subtle highlights on the edges. This process allowed us to understand how we can realistically recreate these subtle highlights and consistent shadows in our layout. So how do we create these shadows? It's supposed to be animation. OK, imagine this animating. So how do we create these shadows? In order to make our shadows feel real, we needed to create a technically audacious system that did more than just pre-rendered static drop shadow. So with our amazing engineering team, they've built a system that uses real-time soft shadows. The shadows are projected from a virtual light source that are also being rendered through a camera. So this allowed us to have a consistent set of transforms that keeps this illusion alive as the users move from screen to screen or between apps. Oh, this is the virtual light source animation that didn't play earlier. And there's the virtual camera. So these two types of shadows make up the shadow layers we use in material design. The key shadow creates the illusion of depth, while the ambient shadow defines the form of the material. Together, the shadows create a halo around the material without needing to use a hard stroke to create an outline. Aha, animation. OK, shadows also create the separation between surfaces. What this means is that the depth of our shadow changes scale and focus. So elements closer to the camera have more diffuse shadows, and elements further away from the camera, the shadow becomes more focused. So the strength of the shadow really determines the perceived depth of our material. You can really see the differences between the perceived depth in these two examples. The scale of the shadow helps to show where these elements live spatially. In the example on the left, the surface of the dialogue is closer to the camera, resulting in a softer shadow, whereas in the example on the right, cars are further away from the camera, resulting in a more defined shadow. And because our shadows are dynamic, they also move in space depending on the location of the material as the camera is fixed. Like this example, when you start to see the shadows move from the left and right and how it's moving below the surface, you can clearly see how the surface is being brought to life. All of these details might be subtle, but it really makes up the whole experience. The shadows provide a familiar visual cue that we just naturally understand. So all of the theory behind shadows may sound super complex, but don't worry, they're all built into the system. Designers can download an Illustrator file that has the shadows, and you guys can use them to design your mocks, but don't use them to make assets. Engineers can simply set the Z height value and get system shadows for Polymer and Android for free. Now that we've covered how the shadows are built, let's look at some examples of how they're used. A good way to think about these surfaces is that they're tools to help focus attention and create emphasis. So Fab, a floating action button, is a great example of how we use surfaces to help focus attention. Just by virtue of being its own separate piece of material, Fabs have the most prominence in our UI, and this really helps to promote the action. A dialogue is another great example. Bringing a dialogue to surface creates an isolation of the content and allows the users to focus on things that require their decision or action. Here's a bad example of how you can overuse shadows and dimensions in your layout. Having a surface on surface in this layout distracts from being able to focus attention. So if you see that your design requires too many layers, then maybe your content is too complex. Shadows should really be used to determine the surface, where you want your primary content to be. Surfaces are powerful grouping tools for our content. Like in this cards example, we can use surfaces to group complex content into a digestible view. This creates a visual system that keeps our layout clean and beautiful by organizing our type and imagery, especially with complex data. But we want to avoid using surfaces when it's not necessary. In this list example, separating each list into cards adds unnecessary visual noise. And this also makes it very difficult to scan the content quickly. Surfaces also indicate interaction cues, like how things are going to move and interact in a space. For example, the peaking surface in Calculator is a hint to the user that it can be pulled out to reveal something new or different from the content they're currently viewing. So we have this super helpful tool called the white frames that you guys can download from our spec. They're basic structures without any content, so you guys can use them when you guys are designing your app. These layout structures use the consistent approach that I mentioned today about surface, layers, and shadows. And we really developed these tools for us designers and developers to support how we can better lay out our content in a meaningful way.
So we've been talking today about how bold graphic design can do more than just look great. We've looked at examples of typography and how it helps people to focus and parse the content. We've seen how the right image at the right time can make all the difference. We've seen how color can bring both brand and also help to divide space, help people to understand. We've seen how that grids and key lines can bring structure, and they're just the coolest. I don't know, I'm excited because they're like this hidden superpower that you apply it, and then all of a sudden everything just kind of comes into focus, and things just look amazing. And finally, we've seen how implied surface can give people cues about how they can interact, but also help to divide content. It's another tool we can use to structure our apps. Ultimately, though, the goal behind this material design system is to create a common backstory. This backstory can help bring visual designers, animators, interaction designers, engineers together, and help to create a story that is consistent for users. And in some ways, this is a collaboration between all of us, as we're creating apps that people can use based on their shared understanding of how the system can work. They can know how to do things without thinking about it. So to learn more, check out the information in the preview release of the design specifications. It's not short, so it'll take a few hours to read through, but there's a lot of really good content. Also, if you're interested in following our work or reaching out, you can check out google.com/design. And if you've not been able to catch some of the other design-focused sessions in I/O, you can see them later. And there's one more session this afternoon at 4 p.m. to talk about motion design. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's still a few more hours left. We have designers who've been working on this project over the past, I think it's been over a year and a half, down in the design sandbox. Please take advantage of this. Don't be shy. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. All right. So it looks like we're right on time. We've saved some time for questions. If you have questions, please line up at either of the microphones in the center of the aisle.
Hi. Any support for SVG in icons or any kind of scalable code solution for all the resolutions that we currently support?
So we actually have Josh here who can answer that question very, very well.
Hi, so I'm an engineer who works with all these designers, and I've been working on how we manage assets and how we generate assets. We're trying to use SVG more and more. It's still a bit of a struggle to use it as the native format that you're using within your apps. Android L is adding some support for that. It's getting better and better on the web, but there's still more we need to do. We are going to be releasing the system icons that we've designed as part of Material on the spec. So you'll get those there, and when we release them, we'll release both ping of various sizes and densities and also the vector versions. So hopefully that will help.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Hi, when you said that the grid has been incorporated sort of conceptually into the material design approach, does that mean that you're strongly recommending that designers use grids for layout, or does this mean that there's new facilities in the framework to actually implement grids at a high level and then the elements would just line themselves up right?
Yeah, so this is something that I think starts with designers. The tools to align things inside the platforms to some degree have existed, I think it does start with designers.
Yeah. And also, all the numbers that are divided by 8, so the 8 dips increments, you can see that in everything. By the size of like the buttons that are provided to you, or nav drawers, or app bar heights, they're all based on 8 dip increments. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of the base components are already using the grids.
Yeah.
After seeing the thinking behind the lighting and the camera and the way shadows move with the elements on screen, is there anything in place to handle orientation changes so that is more of an animated experience rather than a broken experience?
Yeah, so let's see, do we have some more engineering support to talk about the way rotation works? Yeah, so there are system built-in animations for rotation support. There's also some facilities to do custom animations if there's a particular effect that you want in your app.
Hi. I'm a UX designer, but I have a background in graphic design as well. So first I want to congratulate you guys on the design side of things. It's really good to see some traditional graphic design thinking and rules being applied to the digital environment. On my UX side, I've noticed that in terms of affordances, there's a few instances where the outlines of buttons and stuff like that is slightly kind of trying to fade away. I want to ask you guys, how do you feel that apps that have very defined affordances will fit with the new material kind of paradigm design language that you've designed?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of two parts to the question. One is like what are the right affordances, and two, how do we know kind of what the right place is to use those affordances? And for example, in the design system, there are actual material buttons that come off the surface, and they're a really great tool for situations where you have a lot of complex content. So for example, a more complex form where you need a button that's very clear. We don't necessarily need it in all places. Like for example, in the action bars on top of the screen, we don't need to have a separate button around every icon. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the role of the designer here is to look at those situations and make sure that there is enough affordance, and then the system has a number of kind of steps you can use when you do need to have more clarity there.
Thank you.
I really liked the part about color, and I was wondering, I know it's a common thing to desaturate backgrounds to reduce eye strain, and I was wondering about like the really saturated indigo purple and the magenta, and like when does it become too much, and like when do your eyes, like how much can you take of the really bright colors?
So thank you. So I think what you really should consider as a designer is the density of color and content, and how those two interact. Too much color is not a good thing. You as a designer has to figure out where the kind of like sweet spot is. But we believe that we could incorporate more color and express your brand stronger with color without getting tiring your users' eyes. Yeah.
And we're also doing accessibility studies for legibility with color combinations as well, with type overlays.
So first, thank you. It's absolutely beautiful. I actually love everything you guys are doing. I had a few questions about the action bar, because it's gone over some real changes, and I noticed that there's up in some of the examples, there's a darker yellow, but then we see a darker icon instead of a light icon, but then with mixed text where it's white. Also, I see there's no icons in the action bar, and also the hamburger button's really crazy now. It's no longer integrated. Just wondering if you could just give some insights on what's going on with the action bar, because it is a very integral part of applications and unique to Android, really.
Yeah, so I think there's the action bar, I think, is a whole topic in and of itself. I think that there's a few things that we started looking at with the action bar, where there was maybe as we were looking across the whole app ecosystem, that there wasn't enough flexibility for different apps that had different needs to really have the purpose of their app, the shape of their app really match the purpose of the app. And so this is where we've done a lot of work to think about the relationship between the action bar and, for example, a title on the page, where I think there's a number of screens that showed a contact, where it makes a lot more sense to have that to the name of the person really live inside that inside that same kind of conceptual block. So I think that was the first consideration. And as it relates to the branding question of whether or not we need to have an app icon up there or a logo, there's no reason why we couldn't have a logo type or a logo mark up in the action bar. I think that it probably makes sense for a lot of apps to do that, especially on the top level. And then you can decide how much you need it as you dig in deeper.
So more like a content first type of thing.
Yeah.
For the visual. And the hamburger button, anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not every screen or every app needs to have a hamburger button. The ones that do, it's an appropriate place for it, and it lines up with the key line. So you really get this And it's true of the titles too, that you get this kind of resonance with the page.
Well, thank you.
Hi, first I just want to say how all of this design system has been very inspiring. And I had a question about hero images. Is like something that I've seen in the past is when we've had designs that are dominated by a bold hero image. The problem is if it's submitted by the user, sometimes users don't pick very good images. And I wondered if you had any advice on how you can protect against bad user-submitted images.
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. I think one of the things that we were really considering is respecting the user's choices that they're making to really personalize their own imagery. So not manipulating a user's image, I think, is a really important thing to consider. Because potentially it is going to appear pixelated, or it's not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but they're making that kind of conscious decision to include it. It's really tough. We're doing some affordances to play with some color overlays and scrims, but really it's a fine line between kind of over manipulation and respecting the content, right? So yeah, I mean, it kind of depends also on the brand identity of how you're generally treating imagery within your product as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Android developer, and I really loved your session. Thanks. One question or ask I could ask you is, could you upload an XML file with all those typographic scale metrics, paddings, which you want us to use? So then you would imply also naming of all those paddings and title sizes, so it would be consistent across all teams who develop apps. So when you move from one team to another, it would be consistent.
You take that?
Well, no.
I think that there's an intersection here between the design system and the tool systems, and I'm not sure if we have anybody from the tools team that can talk about.
Well, what I would like is, like, you download an XML file, you drop into your project, and you could get all those metrics you displayed here in your project.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've been working on that.
Could I expect this?
I don't know if I can comment on the future path from the tools team, but I think that does sound like something that would be useful to make it easier to use the metrics. I will say that the elements that are built into the framework do respect these grids, and you get a certain level of alignment just there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think I've got a similar question. I was just wondering if you were going to build something into like the system overlay, the debug rendering in Android or something, so that it could show the grid, and so that you could, perhaps make sure elements match up that way. Or, it could go in Android Studio as well. I don't know if it's just something that's been considered.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a good idea. Again, I can't speak to the future plans for of the tool team, but.
For supporting older platforms, are you sort of expecting to go more of incorporating the new material elements even on the older platforms, much in the way we've backported action bars, or to do a more hollow theme on the older platforms and only incorporate the new material elements on L and above? Yeah, so I think that when it comes to the compatibility story, and again, I think that this is a whole topic in and of itself, that you can kind of break it down into some different parts. The first part is for the layouts themselves and for those measurements. For the content itself, the idea of using the 8-pixel grid is something that we've actually been doing since the hollow grids actually use those measurements as well. If you lay out your content with these new things and use that for previous versions, it should work very well. The things that you can also, I don't know how deep I should get into talking about all of the technical features of the support library, but the things, the card view
element that's available in the support library is something you should look into because it will help you to have shadows that work across versions as well.
Thank you.
It's great to see such a great design spec for the first time, I think, in Android. Considering what the competition's done, we all were worried. But I think together I can say it's been very good to be here and to see what you guys have been doing on. It's pretty great. I have no questions, but I'll say keep doing this, keep coming up with design specs which can use. Not everybody's a designer, but for developers out there, it's a very good guideline to use. So keep doing what you're doing. Great work. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. That was a good wrap up.
Yeah, thank you.